This is part two of the presentation on the civil rights movement. I thought we might begin with an example of how far-reaching the Jim Crow system was. Um, this is a publication called the Negro Motorist Green Book from 1955. Um, and to avoid embarrassment, African Americans, when they traveled, wanted to know what businesses would serve them, what motels, what restaurants, what even gas stations, anything like that would serve them and not, refuse and embarrass them and embarrass their families, their children. So they would often buy this book, which would give them some advance warning on that. But what's interesting here is that although Jim Crow as a legal system existed pretty much in the South and a few other border states, uh, this book covers the North as well, the whole country, because there was all kinds of discrimination in the North too. So really, the civil rights movement is a movement against segregation. The first large-scale uh, campaign against segregation uh, began in 1955. It's very well known. It was the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. On December 1st of that year, Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus. Um, it wasn't exactly planned. She didn't know that that day more white passengers would come on and she would be asked to move. But it was planned in this sense that she had decided that she was no longer going to accept that. She was no longer going to move. The bus driver was a notorious racist, well known in the black community. He called the police and she was arrested. Um, the next step was to boycott the buses, to refuse to ride the buses, and this was very, very effective. The leader of this boycott was a young minister by the name of Martin Luther King. He was unknown nationally before this, but this was the event that really propelled him into national prominence. The national press got involved. This was not just an Alabama story, it was a national story. Finally, the particular issue of the bus segregation in Montgomery was settled by a Supreme Court decision in 1956. Uh, but that is only the tip of the iceberg. Um, this bus, which is actually held in the Henry Ford in Dearborn, you can see it at the museum, uh, is the one where Rosa Parks made her famous stand. Um, she was fingerprinted, booked as a criminal, uh, but the boycott began to have its effect. The majority of riders were African Americans, and it was almost 100% effective. They simply did not ride the city buses, and that created all sorts of financial problems for the bus system of Montgomery. They used carpools. Many of those who used the buses were women who worked as maids or servants of some kind in homes owned by whites. Uh, the uh, the mayor of Montgomery criticized white women who would sometimes pick up their maids and give them a ride to work. And the response of the women was, "Well, if you don't like it, Mr. Mayor, you clean our houses." So this demonstrated that these workers really did have economic power, and they learned how to take advantage of it very effectively. Um, the meeting at uh, almost immediately after the arrest of Rosa Parks led to a decision to boycott the buses for one day. But very quickly they decided to extend that, uh, and it was in effect for almost a year. Um, I want to list some major civil rights milestones. There are many, many more that we're not listing here. but let's go through some of them. There were lunch counters throughout the South in what were called dime stores at the time, five and dime stores, like Woolworths or Kresge's, for example. And they would have just counters with stools built in. They would serve, hamburgers, French fries, milkshakes, nothing fancy. Um, and they were segregated. No, not only segregated, they didn't separate the races. They simply banned blacks from using these counters at all. Well, there were students who protested this and sat in at lunch counters. And they won some victories on this. I'll have more to say about this when I show you a photo of some of them. The University of Mississippi was all white. James Meredith uh, entered. He was an African American who became the first black student at the University of Mississippi. It took federal force, federal marshals, to safely enroll him at the university. Um, a lot of stores that practiced racial discrimination were part of national chains of stores. Woolworths, for example, was a national chain. So was Kresge's. Their headquarters was in Detroit, actually. Um, and African Americans around the country said, well, it's not enough to, you know, eliminate segregation or to allow equal access to your stores in the North. We expect you to do it throughout the country, in the South too. And if you don't, we will boycott your whole chain. Every one of your stores all over the country, we will boycott. And that was effective. Um, there was a court decision that gave blacks the right to ride without segregation on interstate buses. Well, there was enormous resistance to this in the South, and the Freedom Riders were mixed groups of whites and blacks who rode those buses. And that was another assault on the system of Jim Crow. Uh, it starts to come to a head with the famous March on Washington in 1963. You may remember that A. Philip Randolph proposed a march on Washington 22 years earlier in 1941 on the eve of the U.S. involvement in World War II. And President Roosevelt did not want something as divisive as that when they were so close to war. So he offered the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, in exchange for Randolph canceling the March on Washington then. But now there was a new set of issues. And this time the march was going to go forward. And Randolph, who was an old man by this time, helped to organize it and attended it as one of the most prominent people there. That, of course, was also the setting in which Martin Luther King gave the most famous speech of the entire civil rights movement. That, of course, was his I Have a Dream speech. Just a couple of weeks after that, in August of '63, there was an event that absolutely outraged the nation. There were 4 children killed in a bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. And this got all sorts of national attention, and it simply underlined for not just for Southerners, but for everyone in the nation, the brutality of the system of segregation. Now let's look at some photos of some of this. This is a lunch counter, and in some cities, for example, Nashville, there were organized attempts to do this, and typically the person behind the counter would just put up a sign that says lunch counter closed. But these mostly they were students. They wouldn't go away. They were often insulted, abused by whites. The police would often just stand by and say, well, we warned you, we can't help it if you're getting a hard time. So they refused to enforce all the laws, giving them the right to personal protection. And typically they were arrested and carried away. This was nonviolent civil disobedience. They would not put up any resistance, but they would also not cooperate. They had to be carried away. If they were given a choice of um, a fine or jail time, they would choose the jail time. They would do nothing to cooperate with the authorities who were trying to protect the system of Jim Crow. Very often students did this because they didn't have jobs. If an employed person did this, then the result would often be losing one's job. There was a lot of training in advance of this. Uh, they would do role playing, for example, in which they would get a taste beforehand in the safe environment of a meeting of the kinds of abuse, verbal and physical, that they would face, um, so that they were prepared for it. And they absolutely did not fight back. They accepted arrest. This was a philosophy of nonviolence that was very much advanced by Gandhi in India and furthered by Martin Luther King in the United States. This is the scene at the University of Mississippi. James Meredith in the center here needed all this protection just to go to college. And I mentioned the Freedom Riders. They often needed armed guards for protection. Um, in a way, the best friend of the civil rights movement in Birmingham, Alabama, was a commissioner by the name of Bull Connor. He was in charge of the police, and he ordered attacks with fire hoses, attacks with dogs. And you have to remember that television news had arrived by this time, national television news. And tactics like this were broadcast all over the country, and they shocked the conscience of the nation. This, of course, is the huge crowd on the Mall in Washington while Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech. Now, this March on Washington was especially intended to promote the Civil Rights Bill. Not long after this, in November, President Kennedy was assassinated. He had proposed a Civil Rights Bill, but it was left to Lyndon Johnson, the new president, to push it through Congress. In 1964, there was a big campaign for voting rights also. It was called Freedom Summer. And those who pursued them were often subject to violence. There were deaths involved in this. And at the same time, in 1964, there was a major push to get this civil rights bill through Congress. Lyndon Johnson was a master politician. He was very experienced and very good at getting legislation through Congress. He was sort of an unlikely hero of the civil rights movement. He was from Texas, and certainly, grew up in a society that practiced segregation. But he did not believe in that, and he worked tirelessly to get this bill through Congress. The state of Mississippi sent an all-white delegation to the Democratic National Convention in 1964. This put Johnson in an awkward position because a presidential candidate wants unity in his party. But there were two Democratic delegations. One, the regular white Democrats of Mississippi, and the other, what was called the Freedom Democratic Party. This was a group of African Americans who demanded to be included. They reached a compromise that two of them would be accepted into the delegation, but that in the future there would be no segregation at events like this. There were marches pushing for voting rights from Selma to Montgomery, and there was violence, there were arrests. We're passing over a lot of history here to try to keep this presentation to a reasonable length, but each one of these is a whole story in itself. The final push, the last major piece of legislation in the civil rights movement, was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You may remember that voting rights without regard to race were guaranteed for all men at that time, going all the way back to 1870 when the 15th Amendment was ratified. But it took another 95 years before that right to vote became real throughout the country. And of course, by this time, since women had gotten the right to vote in 1920, this meant voting rights for men and women, regardless of the color of their skin. Um, this is a photo of the Selma to Montgomery March. These marches were integrated. Whites and blacks worked together during this time. Um, Now, let's talk about these major pieces of legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had major provisions. One was no discrimination in public accommodations. That means businesses that are open to the public, such as hotels or restaurants or stores or lunch counters or anything like that. It's amazing when in today's America to realize that not that long ago it was completely legal for, say, a restaurant owner to put a sign in the window that said "Whites only, welcome here." With the Civil Rights Act, that was no longer legal. Uh, it is not legal either to discriminate in hiring someone on the basis of race. This is harder to enforce, but it's a little easier to enforce when you're dealing with large companies, because if they hire, say, 300 people in a year and they're all white, then there's no doubt that they are practicing discrimination, and this is illegal, and the government can sue them over this issue. Um, it also gave the government greater power to sue for school integration. Remember the Brown versus Board of Education decision from 54, from 10 years earlier, made it unconstitutional, but enforcing it, making it actually happen, was a whole other matter, and now it was easier to do that. At the same time, the 24th Amendment was ratified. There were 5 southern states that still had poll taxes, and the Supreme Court had upheld the legality, the constitutionality of the poll tax in 1937, so it was felt that a constitutional amendment was necessary to get rid of them, and that's what happened here. So it is no longer allowable under the U.S. Constitution to charge someone for voting. Now, the Voting Rights Act, it put teeth into the 15th Amendment. Any area with a history of voting discrimination, and this certainly included southern states, would have to be overseen by the federal government, and any changes in their system of voting would have to be approved by the Department of Justice. And this was actually finally an effective guarantee of the right to vote. Now, the standard dates for the movement are about 1955 to 1965, or 54 if you want to begin it with the Brown versus Board decision. At the end, after the Voting Rights Act was passed, the focus started to change from the South to the North, and from legal issues to economic issues, to the fact that many African Americans had inferior jobs. They were poor housing. There was discrimination in neighborhoods, not allowing people to live where they chose to. And with this move to the north, there was a decline in cooperation between blacks and whites. This was also the time for the Black Power movement, which we'll deal with in another context. And there was a white backlash, partly from urban violence. There were civil disturbances, riots sometimes in a lot of northern cities, and this deepened the divisions between whites and blacks. So in this period that followed the formal civil rights movement was a very difficult one, and it's one that we'll deal with at another time.